Hello and welcome to Tea with Jess. I'm Jess Montgomery and I'm the author of the Kinship Historical Mystery Series. And as one of my characters, Nana, likes to say, life is hard, have tea. So I'm taking a little tea break to chat with all of you. Thank you for all who are tuning in live. Thank you for all who watch later. And thank you for people who tune into the podcast version of this. And today I'm excited to have a friend, John Scalzi, as my tea break guest. I'm pretty sure you've heard of him, but just in case you haven't, John is a New York Times bestseller in fiction. His first published series novel, Old Man's War, was a Hugo Award nominee for Best Novel and has since gone on to rank #1 on the Locus Online Reader Poll and is listed on the NPR.com reader poll of the top 100 science fiction and fantasy books in the series. How cool is that? Since then, he's published many, many books and he's won many awards, including the Hugo, the Locus, the Audie, among others. And since we're both in Ohio, one of my favorite awards of his, I don't know what his favorite award is, but my favorite award of his is the 2016 Governor's Award for the Arts in Ohio. And his work has been translated into 30 plus languages. He's a creative consultant for television series, writes for a video game, and actually I found this very interesting when I was doing a little research for his bio. There's a series that now we're going to watch in our household called Love, Death, and Robots. And it's an animated series for adults. And 5 of his short stories have been adapted into episodes for that Netflix series, which I think is pretty cool. The other thing to know about John that I very much like about him is that he loves pie. And I love to bake pie. And he once taught at the workshop I directed, Antioch Writers Workshop, gave keynote address. And I think he would have come anyway, but I did offer to bring him pie if he would speak. And I did. He did speak, and I did bring him pie. He was very inspiring to everybody in that audience. And I'll bake a pie for John anytime. So now let's bring on John. Hello. Whoops. There
Here
we
I
go.
am.
Lost him for just a second. He disappeared into an alternate universe.
Yes.
Which kind of fits the book that you have to some degree, coming out March 15th, right?
March 15th, yes.
The Kaiju Preservation Society. And the premise is really interesting to me. You've got a driver who's kind of in a dead-end job driving for food delivery apps, makes a delivery for an old acquaintance who works at an animal rights organization, which sounds pretty okay, except the animal rights organization is for kaiju. Yeah. And these are like, well, we were talking earlier, like kind of Godzilla-like creatures from an alternate dimension. And this is all taking place during COVID. So, wow. So
no metaphors there. No metaphors there.
What could possibly be stomping through around the universe? Tell us a little bit more about that. What a fabulous premise.
Well, thank you. I mean, for me, it was kind of interesting to write. What had happened was in 2020, I was writing a completely different novel. And that completely different novel was a dark and gritty political thriller in space, because I write science fiction. And I don't know if you remember 2020. I realize it's been a long time, but 2020 was not the right year to write a dark and gritty political thriller, whether or not it was in space or not. And I was just grinding my gears for like literally months on it. And it got to the point early in 2021 where I just had to admit defeat and say to my editor, I was like, I can't do this. I can't. And he was like, that's fine, even though we have it on the schedule and we've already commissioned art for the cover and it's already in the sales chain. that's fine. We'll just take it off. That's fine. And
That's a very understanding editor.
I mean, this is what he says to me. I'm sure that, as soon as he got off, the email chain with me, he was saying something else. But so I was just like relieved. It's like this thing that was dragging me down. I didn't have to do anymore. I went to go take a shower, and the back of my brain was like, hey, okay, so now that you're not panicking about that book you were never going to write anyway, I've been thinking about kaiju, and literally the whole book downloaded into my brain. And I finished showering first, but then I immediately went back and I started typing to Patrick. I was like, hey, remember that book that was supposed to be due in like a couple of weeks? I was like, give me a couple of weeks, you'll have a new book. And I wrote kaiju in about 5 weeks because it just literally was all there. And I do think it's absolutely, to some extent, a COVID metaphor, because, kaiju are specifically these Japanese monsters, and everybody knows them through, Godzilla and Mothra and Gamera and all of these things. And for the last couple of years, we've had a monster stomping through our culture as well. And it's not a one-to-one. It's not like, look, here's the metaphor or anything like that. I don't want to do that to my readers, but it takes place from March 2020 to March 2021, which is prime time for our own big creature stomping through the culture.
That's an amazing premise. I love that premise. So that leads actually to my next question. How do you know when you have a good premise, a good idea? I mean, it's fascinating to me that, maybe your gritty political one is a great idea for 2 years from now.
Right. Yeah.
But
that is a really excellent question, because one of the things that people who don't write always ask is like, where do you get your ideas? Right. Because they think that ideas are rare and expensive. And the answer is no, they're not rare and expensive at all. Like literally anything could be an idea. And like when I do talks where I, make this point, I'm like, let's do Mad Libs. Give me a noun. And someone says a cat. And someone says, and I say, give me another noun, a blender, and I was like, a cat and a blender get together. They solve crime. There's an idea. It's a terrible idea. But the whole point of it is that you have all of these ideas, and the really important thing is to find out which ones are good and which ones are not. And sometimes you have to get all the way to the point of actually writing them, right, before you find out whether or not it's a good idea or not. But mostly speaking, for me, what I do is I Thunderdome them, which is like if I have an idea I'm thinking about, like an idea will pop into my head and I'll be like, oh, that sounds interesting. And then I don't write it down. And then the next day, if I've forgotten that idea, then it wasn't that good of an idea, because otherwise I would have remembered it. But if I remember the next day, I'm like, oh, okay, well, that survived. And then I don't, write it down. And then a week later, if I don't remember, the same sort of thing. The ideas that persist in my brain that my brain can't help but think about are the ones that I eventually write. Now, kaiju, like I said, was a sort of an exception to this rule, because I didn't know I was thinking about it, but clearly my brain was. Because, like I said, when this other book just slid off the schedule, my brain just was ready to go with this one. I'm just, and I would really like to interrogate my brain. It's like, why haven't you done this for me previously? Because this was the easiest book I ever wrote, right? Like, just everything about it was fun and easy. And especially after, nearly a year of trying to get the other one to work, it was just the easiest thing that I've ever written. And I'm angry about it, because it's like, every book should be like this. Every book should be this easy. And yet it's not. And I really resent my brain for making me go through 9 months of torture first before giving me this thing that I could write in 5 weeks.
Well, your brain would probably say, so while you were torturing yourself for 9 months, I was working, and that's why the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's true. I mean, I really do think that brains problem solve in ways that we're not necessarily paying attention to. There was one time not too long ago where I just literally lost track of my schedule, and I realized I had a book due in 2 weeks. And I had written nothing on it. So I wrote the book in 2 weeks. Right. which one I don't recommend because,
No.
RSI and, mental RSI as well. But the thing is, the reason I was able to do it was one, because by that time I had written several books. But the other thing was, even if I hadn't been paying attention, my brain knew in the background that I actually had to be thinking about this. So it did the work for me so that when I came down to actually writing it, I wasn't writing so much as typing. And that really helped. Again, absolutely do not recommend it. And generally speaking, I much prefer the rather more sedate pace that I usually do of, doing a couple thousand words a day and then, just plodding along on that sort of way. But it's nice to know that when, I've completely, the conscious version of John Scalzi has completely messed up. The subconscious version would be like, fine, I'll come to the rescue again.
Let
And
me
there we
help
go.
you.
Yeah,
Well, see, this
exactly.
I find reassurance in this, so that because this tells me I should honor the characters and voices and ideas that keep pestering me in my head instead of
Mhm.
going, I'm so used to you. You can't possibly be important. I need to go find something else. Maybe not. Maybe I should listen to what's already in there knocking around going, hello. Is
Yeah.
it my
Well,
turn
no, I
yet?
mean, it's everyone's process is a little bit different, but I mean, I do think it is the ideas that stay with you, the ideas that just never leave, that are always sort of there, kind of poking at you. They are the ones that, for one reason or another, have persisted, and at the very least, it's worth interrogating why they persisted. Now,
Yeah.
I've had story ideas there that I have had in my brain for like a decade. And then after a decade, they sort of fell apart, right? Like,
Mhm.
either my brain was tired of rolling it around in my brain, or alternately, it was just like, no, that's fundamentally not going to work, and I don't want to expend the time on it. But the time spent thinking about that book was not time lost, because elements of the things that I was thinking about for that possible book made their way into other stuff I was doing. So,
That makes sense. That makes
sure.
sense. So, um, COVID plays a role in your new book.
Yeah.
Um, but so how did the whole COVID experience, obviously, I'm sure you had many events that were canceled, but how did the pandemic affect your writing routine or, your approach to your creative work, or did it?
Well, it was really interesting because, so, uh, I found out about COVID while I was on a cruise. People started coming up to me and telling me about a friend of mine that had caught COVID. And I was like, okay, thanks for letting me know. And then we got home and then everything was shut down. And for me, for the first couple months, it just didn't seem that bad because, I've spent almost all my time up in my office anyway. Right.
Right.
So the whole thing of it's like, now we're all at home. I was like, I was home anyway. Um, but over time, it begins to weigh on you. Right. The
Mhm.
whole, not just the thing of, when I'm at home, I'm home because I want to be home. And when I'm not seeing people, it's because I don't want to see people. I am a functional introvert. I can handle humans, but eventually I want them all to go away. But I want to have the option, right? I want to have the option
Yeah.
of being able to see people. And for like a literal year, the people I saw were my wife, my child, my mother-in-law, and my pets. So, and after a while, that begins to weigh on you. And I think I was not any different than anybody else. It's like, I'll have lots of time to do lots of creative things. But as it turned out for me, like I said, trying to write this novel, it's just the weight of the world kind of got on me. It wasn't just COVID. It was the election year. It was
Mhm.
also all the social upheaval and unrest that was going on in 2020. And then at the end of the year, all the swabs and blood tests tell me I didn't get COVID, but there was something going on in my brain where for most of November and December, I couldn't formulate a thought beyond that was more complex than, did you know that cheese is really good? right? That was about as far as I could get with the thinking.
Oh
And
gosh.
and I absolutely thought it was a COVID because my daughter had caught COVID. She was fine because she's young, but I was like, well, it makes sense that I had this. And at some point, Chrissy, my wife, who's kind of was like, it's possible that you didn't have COVID, you just had a breakdown. And I was like, that's entirely possible. Just after
Yeah.
the stress of COVID and the election and everything else that was going on in 2020, my brain was just like, done. Let's bundle up in a blanket and watch Lord of the Rings 17 times in a row.
And
Right?
have cheese.
Yes, exactly. Cheese for everybody.
Cheese for everybody.
So, and the thing is I would, when I would be talking to friends, we would all have the same thing. They would be like, dude, same, right? Everybody wanted to be creative. Everybody wanted to make all that sourdough or do whatever it was that we were doing. But the fundamental thing about creativity is creativity doesn't generally react to stress very well, right? If you live in interesting times, as the metaphor goes, people are like, well, that's going to be great for art. There's going to be all this protest art. It's like, no, people are stressed. They're thinking about how they're going to live their lives. They're worried about their family members. They're worried about how they're going to feed themselves, because a lot of people, lost their jobs, at least temporarily. And all of that stuff distracts from being able to be creative. Now, I have been and always, and have for some time been in a very fortunate position that I didn't have to worry about money, and I didn't have to worry about, whether the lights were going to go out. But I did have family that I worried about. I was worried about, other friends who are not as fortunate as I was, and and just generally all the things that were happening kind of got to me. And I think that the most important thing for people to realize, one, that this can happen to anyone. But the second thing is that it's okay to acknowledge that you're stressed and that your creativity is contingent on feeling secure enough that you can actually devote brain cycles to creativity instead of feeling like you have to be in survival mode for an entire year or 18 months or whatever. And the thing about kaiju was that was the point at which my brain was like, you don't have to be in survival mode anymore. You can actually think about creativity. You can think about things that are fun. You can write a comedy, even though the last year has been tragedy. And so that was one of the reasons why I say to people, it's like, it may not be the deepest book that I've ever written, right? But it is absolutely the book I needed to write. And the response from people who have read it so far really has been, this is the book that they needed to read.
Awesome.
We've been comparing it to, it's not a brooding symphony, it's a pop song. And it's like, it's 3 minutes, it's got a hook, and you can sing along with the chorus. And I think after the last couple of years, everybody sort of needs a catchy pop song right about now.
Yeah, that sounds wonderful. Now, I've asked you this before in previous interviews, but I'm going to ask again.
Okay.
So, why sci-fi? How did you land on sci-fi as your genre versus, say, I don't know, mystery?
Mystery. Well, therein lies a tale. I'm sure I've never told it to you before. But I was in 1997, which was when I decided that I needed to see if I could write a novel. I couldn't decide whether I wanted to write a mystery / crime, novel or science fiction, because both of those genres were genres that I read in and felt confident enough to at least to take a stab at, but I just couldn't decide. So what I literally did was I flipped a coin, right? And if it went on heads, it would be science fiction. And if it landed on tails, I would try mystery. And it landed on heads. And so I wrote Agent to the Stars, which eventually became my second published book, but it was the first book that I had written. And I always think about that coin flip, right? Because if I had not landed on heads, my life would be completely different. not only might I not have finished that first novel just to see if I could write a novel, but if I did, I mean, the reason that I wrote Old Man's War, which was my second novel, although my first published, was because I had already written in science fiction, and I had already kind of tweaked my analysis of what I did right and wrong for Agents of the Stars to when I was going to start writing Old Man's War. So if I had written that first one as a mystery novel, then it's entirely possible that the second one would have been a mystery novel as well. And who knows whether or not that would have been published or not. And if it had been published, if it would have had the same impact that Old Man's War had in both science fiction in terms of sales and in the community. And so on and so on and so on. I would not have met all the people that I have met. I suspect I would have met you eventually, because my coming to Ohio was about my wife deciding to be closer to family, as opposed to Ohio is the place where you go to write science fiction, right?
Well, that would make a great slogan. Let's have that.
We went to Ohio to write science fiction, as one does.
As one does.
As one does. But who knows how many books I would have published, and and all the things that had proceeded, the people I've met, the places that I've gone. Now it's entirely possible that I might have been even more successful in mystery than science fiction. Who knows? But I suspect I landed where I should have been. But yeah. I do think about that coin flip. That was a really weird sort of inflection point in my life, and I really didn't even think about it at the time, other than, I guess I'm going to write science fiction.
Now, when you saw Heads and said, "Oh, that's science fiction," did you feel this sort of like, "Oh, great"?
No, I mean, it was just the sort of thing. The thing that I actually thought was, no matter if I was writing a mystery or if I was writing science fiction, I was going to be writing about Hollywood, because I had been a film critic for years and years and years and years and years.
Right.
So that was a milieu that I knew about, right? So, in science fiction, it became Agents of Stars, which was the log line for that would be aliens come to Earth, make first contact, seek Hollywood representation. And it makes sense, because all our experience of aliens really is through, film and TV. And then if it had been a mystery, I mean, I don't know what I would have written, but it's not exactly like there aren't a whole bunch of places to go in Hollywood, for a murder, Yeah. So as far as that goes, either way it would have been Hollywood. So, but yeah, since it landed on Heads, I was like, okay, well, now how do I make Hollywood and science fiction work? And that was the thing of aliens. They need an agent,
Of course they do.
Of course they do.
That's wonderful. And there's a lot for people to pull from that of the creativity and finding your path, figuring out which way you want to go, understanding that there are ripple effects rolling forward, and trust his subconscious brain.
Sure. Well, but the other thing that I want to actually accentuate to people, and I think this is really important, because humans can be linear creatures, right? Is that nothing is ever final, right? Right. So, one of my absolute favorite current stories in science fiction is fantasy is Martha Wells. Martha Wells has been riding high the last couple of years on her Murderbot series of books, right? She won the Hugo Award for Best Novel this last year. She's won other Hugos because of that. And that comes after being just plugging away for 30 years in science fiction and fantasy, and always producing good stuff, right? But that stuff didn't necessarily catch fire in terms of sales, and there were certain points where I know that Martha was like, why do I keep doing this? Is there something else I can be doing with my time? But then, about 5 years ago, she came across this concept of Murderbot, which is a cyborg who is designed to kill things, but would rather just watch, TV and all the adventures that they go on to have, and it just took off. It is literally one of the most beloved series of books and one of the most beloved characters in science fiction in the 21st century. And it wouldn't have happened if she had just decided to throw in, or had she thought that, I didn't hit when I was in my 20s, or in my 30s or something like that, so it's not going to happen for me. She just kept going. And I think that's incredibly encouraging. I mean, sometimes people hit early, sometimes people hit late, sometimes they never hit at all, but they still write stuff that speaks to them and to some other people. It's all something that I think it's really important for people to realize. It's like, it ain't over until it's over.
That's right.
Yes.
And you have to find the joy in the creating.
Right.
Yeah.
Even you have to like what you're doing, because if you don't like what you're doing,
right.
then no one else is going to like it either. I mean, I am very fortunate that I am the world's least patient reader, and that includes my own stuff. So if I'm typing it and I'm like, I'm so bored, then clearly there's a problem. And I'm not going to inflict it on other people. I will stop what I'm doing and make it more interesting to myself before I give it to anybody else.
That is a good thing to do.
Yes.
So total subject change. I think you and your beloved wife bought a church.
Yes, we did.
And I am so charmed by that and intrigued by that. And so I have all these ideas of like what you all could do with the church and maybe why you bought it. Like, is this something you're doing to create a venue to in some way give back to the community in which you live? Are you starting the religion of John Scalzi? I mean, what's happening with this church?
It's funny because when we made the announcement that we had bought the church, people are like, "No, science fiction writers and religion, bad idea. What are you doing?" And I had to reassure people. I actually put on my blog, it's like, I'm not going to start a religion. I assure you of this.
I was 99.9% sure you weren't, but
right. But just in case anyone's wondering, once again, issuing the standard denial, I will not be starting a religion. My wife and I are both ordained through the Universal Life Church. And we have done, for the purpose of basically our friends would be getting married, and they're like, we don't actually have a religious tradition, so we don't know what to do. And then Chris and I were like, we're coming anyway. We'll absolutely do this. And so I've done about a dozen weddings over the years, and Chrissy's done, I think, almost as many. So it's kind of fun for us, but converting that, so to speak, off to an actual new religion is not in the cards. The story behind it is actually fairly mundane, but is interesting. And actually, you're not wrong on some of the reasons why we got the church. So the first aspect of it is that, so I am now 30 years into a writing career, and more than 15 years into a fiction writing career. I have a lot of intellectual property, as the kids would call it, which just means a pile of books that goes up to the ceiling. And one of the things that I don't really have a whole lot of time to do personally is to oversee a lot of things like licensing or merchandising or so on and so forth, mostly because my job is to actually write the books. But my wife has an incredible head for business, and she wants to retire from her current job at some point in the reasonably near future. So we were talking about, when she retires from the job that she has, that she would then become CEO of Scalzi Corp, which is not actually what we call it, by the way. And that then we would start actually actively looking for licensing deals and to do other things. And if we do that and it's successful, we will need office space, because if we have to hire people, we don't want them to come to the house and work in our house because it's our house. And also, it's generally a good idea for psychological reasons to keep a lot of your business in one place and your home in another, right?
Yes.
When you're a writer, you can be flexible about that. But even here, I have an office that's my office, and that's where I do the work. And we had been looking around for property near where we live, and there wasn't really anything that was specifically good for what we wanted to do. And we decided that one of the things we could do is look at land, and then like build a pole barn and then put offices inside of it and all that sort of stuff. So I went on to a real estate site to look for like a couple of acres of land or something like that. And as it turns out, literally like 2 or 3 hours earlier, the old United Methodist Church in my little town went on the market. And I looked at it and I immediately was like, huh, I could own a church. Huh, how cool. But beyond that, the structure is large enough and the structure has enough multifunctionality that it absolutely can be used for office space and can be used for other things. And also, because apparently it's difficult to sell church structures in tiny, small Ohio towns, the price was ridiculous, right? And so we both looked at it and was like, well, we're going to go look at this like right now, right? And my wife has a job that she basically looks at buildings and looks at their soundness. And so she was crawling through the innards of this church, and she was like, no, this is solid, right? So like literally by the end of the day, we had made the offer on it, and it got accepted. And of course, we couldn't tell anybody about it until everything closed. But yeah, so the goal is it's going to be office space for Scalzi Corp, or what, which is again not what we're going to call it, but it's also, the thing is, and this goes back to your point, we're keeping the pews, we're keeping the common area. And one of the things that we would really like to do is, have an area where we can do book readings or concerts, and open it up to the local community, not for like, we're going to charge you $20 for, coming to see this thing, but more of, no, this community that I live in, Bradford, Ohio, has been very good to us. We came from out of town, and in many ways, I'm kind of an odd duckling. I'm a liberal science fiction writer in a conservative rural area, but it's been good for us, and the people have been kind, and we want to make sure that this building, which has been here for close to 100 years, which people have memories in, and has been part of the community and has been outward facing to the community, is not completely inward facing, right? That it's not just, we bought the church and now nobody ever goes in and sees what happens. It's like, no, we want to be able to do stuff. Now, it's going to take time because, the first thing we have to do is fix the roof, and the electrical is 80 years old, and all these sorts of things. But and it will actually be, of course, on a day-to-day basis, office space. But absolutely, we want to be able to have it still be part of the community, because the community is important to us.
I think that's really cool. My husband's a scientist by day, but his avocation is barbershop singing. And he knows a ton of really good quartets. And I told him, guess what? John Scalzi and his wife bought a church, and I don't know what they're going to do with it. And he was immediately like, I can hook them up with all kinds of really great barbershop quartets and a cappella groups if they want to have performances. So
it'll be here's this venue all of a sudden. No, and the thing, the top 5 things that people want for this is one, a music venue, right? Because they're like, oh, you absolutely need to, have music there because, the sanctuary. They want a bookstore, which I'm like, I'm not, Jane Mary's bookstore of Troy, Ohio is there. I'm not going to step on their thing. They want it to be a restaurant and or coffee shop. I'm like, no, again,
that's a lot of licensing,
a lot of work. It does have, a kitchen because it was a church, right? And they would be like, come on down for the chicken dinners and stuff like that. And we may, we're definitely going to refurb the kitchen, and who knows, maybe we'll do a chicken noodle dinner at some point or another, but definitely not on a professional basis. Someone, and the other thing is people are like, you could make it a goth club. And I'm like, maybe one day out of the year we will make it a goth club, like Halloween, goth club or something like that. But Bradford, Ohio, population 1,800 with 9 churches, rural conservative area, not really the place for a goth club. No. So everybody has all these ideas. And I'm like, you know what? When you buy a church, you can do that thing.
Your thing. Yes.
Right. And
your ideas sound wonderful. And I think it's so lovely that you recognize that, there may be 9 churches in the community and this was one of them, or number 10 or whatever, but people do. I'm sure they remember their kid being baptized, being married, funeral services, to other touching moments, not necessarily just milestone moments. So it's nice that you're looking at ways that you can open up.
I mean, we've also been here now for 21 years, which is, when I think about it, it just makes me giggle. Because of course I grew up in the Los Angeles area, right? Los Angeles County. And to go from a place that has 10 million people to a place that has 1,800, and a completely different lifestyle and completely all that sort of stuff is kind of ridiculous. But, this is where our daughter grew up and where she went to school. It's like we do have roots in this community now. And, it took a while for us, our house until our daughter started going to school, was known as, the Yost house, because the people who lived there before, it's like, oh, they're the people who live in the Yost house, so it took a while, but, it's when we bought the church, I was at the grocery store and people come up, did you buy the church? We heard you bought the church. It's like word gets around in a small town. And there are lots of people who don't live here who's like, you should make it this and that. And I'm like, I'm not going to do anything that's going to antagonize my neighbors or offend them, not just because that's not a good idea in general, but just because I'm not that person. I don't want to not get along with my relatives and, neighbors who live in the area. So as far as that goes, the radical ideas of,
a goth club.
A goth club in the church, right? Yeah, exactly. Like I said, Halloween night, sure, why not? Play ministry all night long, but on a day-to-day basis, that's not why we bought the place.
That's not why you bought it. Well, you mentioned community in the literal sense, the town you live in. You've been the president of your professional organization, Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers, and of course you spoke for the Antioch Writers Workshop, and you speak a lot of different places. So I guess my final question is about community. Another thing that you do that incorporates community and that I've benefited from as a reader and as a writer, and many people have, is, for example, on your blog / website, whatever, which, by the way, everybody go check out whatever.scalzi.com. You have the big idea feature of other authors and their books and the idea behind them. And so these are all acts of generosity. So I guess my final question for this chat with you is, just your thoughts on community as part of the writer's process.
I mean, the thing is, what we as writers do does tend to be an individual thing, and does tend to be a lonely thing, right? Where, most of the time when we're writing, even if we're writing in a coffee shop or in, a writer's collective or something like that, even if there are other people nearby, we are focused on the page. And so it is a profession that can be isolating. But at the same time, I think it's really important that writers speak to other writers about what's going on in the business. Writers speak to each other about the difficulties of the work-life balance of writing, which is a real thing, that they share their experiences, and then also that they develop a peer group, right? Science fiction and fantasy is really good at doing the thing of helping writers develop the peer group, the sort of people that they have come up with, and that they sort of come back to celebrate their successes, to commiserate the failures and all that sort of stuff, but are kind of a social glue for each other. And I really appreciated that when I started connecting to it. I mean, I was not someone who went to science fiction fantasy conventions before I started doing this stuff professionally. But when I got there, I immediately hooked into, a peer group of friends that I have then had since then continued to be tight with. And we have celebrated when one of us has done well, and when things have fallen apart, we've offered support. And it matters because, everybody needs their community, whether it's the community of, the small town that you live in, or this, neighborhood that you live in a larger town, or your alumni, connections, if from high school or college, or professional things, right? Everybody sort of needs those communities to be part of, to bounce out off of, and to have context within. Because without it, there's so much that you don't know about what it is that you're doing. And so for me, doing things like the Big Idea posts, or doing the things where I talk to writers or go to conventions and take part in panels and stuff like that. I mean, I do it partly because it's fun, right? I mean, if this was a chore, I would not be doing it, right? I like talking. But the other part about it is that you recognize that this is important for other people, and it's important for you as well. I have benefited from the kindness of other people in science fiction and fantasy, and in writing in general, and in the concepts of things like pay it forward, which have been promulgated, particularly in science fiction and fantasy, but are in writers' ethos generally speaking anyway, where it's like you help the people who are coming up because the people helped you when you were coming up, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's something I can really believe in, and I think is important. The other aspect of it is, partly through skill, partly through luck, partly through being in the right place at the right time, I have become very successful in my specific field, and I have lived long enough to recognize that wasn't necessarily inevitable, right? That had Old Man's War come out a year earlier or a year later, had I become successful when I was younger rather than in my mid-30s, which is when it happened, or any other number of factors. If I had flipped a coin and it had gone the other way, things could be completely different. And part of that recognition is understanding to me that I feel I have an obligation to give people opportunities and possibilities that may or may not turn out for anything. Putting a big idea on my post, on my website, may not necessarily mean anything other than a couple people see it and they're like, oh, I love this book, and they buy it. But now and again, every once in a while, something that I've done has really benefited someone. And I've had that same thing happen to me. One of my favorite stories is, and this was someone who didn't know who I was at the time. In 2006, Old Man's War was not nominated for a Hugo, right? It was number 6 out of 5, out of 5 slots.
Mm-hmm.
But Neil Gaiman, who had won 3 consecutive Hugos for novel, short story, and novelette, something like that, had been nominated again for Best Novel, right? And he said, you know what? I have won 3 Hugos in a row. I'm fine. Maybe, I'm going to decline the nomination. And the reason he said that was, and we talked about it later when I did get to know him. He says, because I thought it could benefit somebody else more. And he was right, because I was number 6 and I moved up to number 5. And that changed a lot of things, because then I just changed from, oh, it's John Scalzi, to who is John Scalzi? And it meant that this book suddenly became important in this community. It made a huge impact. And he wasn't someone who was doing it for his friend, John Scalzi. He wasn't doing it because he knew that I was the 6th person. He had no idea. He did it simply because he thought, at this point in time, I have benefited enough. It's time to let someone else reap the benefit.
Wow.
And that is a practice and an idea that certainly I have incorporated in my own life. There have been times that I have turned down an award nomination because I was like, it's not, it's time for me to let that one go and let someone else do it. Or there are other reasons that I chose not to do it. But with the and I was like, I wonder who benefited from that. And, and I hope that they did well. But more than that, the idea that, and it's almost like the thing of what is the best kind of charity, which is like, you don't know who's going to benefit. They don't know who is benefiting them. Right. But you do it anyway. And so not all of that is like that, but it's certainly something that you think about, right? It's like, why are you doing it? What are you doing it for? And the thing is that ultimately, the more success more writers have, the better off we all are as writers, right? And even if what I'm doing is just a little bit, right, or just a drop, it still matters, and it still matters to someone, and it matters to me, because I feel like, I have that obligation, and not only the obligation, but a responsibility. And beyond that, I enjoy it. I like being able to support other writers and other people. And, again, I'm a human being. I'm not perfect. And there's lots of things I do that are ridiculous and silly. But in this particular thing, I feel like, these are things I should be doing, and that's why I do them.
That's wonderful. That is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining me on Tea with Jess.
Okay.
And thank you to everybody who is tuning in and who's listening later. And so thank you, John.
You're welcome. And also, I want to do a quick shout out to this person. Look.
Thank you.
We have the same the book release month. You're coming out like a couple of weeks after I am, so I'm super excited about that. So
thank you. I appreciate that. All right. Well, everyone, take care of yourselves. Be kind to each other, and until next time, have a great time. And I'll see you next time on Tea with Jess.